So, all right, Dr. Jha, so that was some key points that you discussed in Chapter 4. Now, Chapter 5, I believe it deals with the evolution of regional inequality and indirect tax structure in India. Could you please summarize India's progress in these areas?
Yeah, thank you very much, Rajinder. Yes, it's a pleasure to talk about this issue. Now, it is a well-known cliche that India is a country of immense diversity. Okay, so as for anybody who's traveled in India, they know that the language changes in a few miles, the cuisine changes, and so on. Though culturally India is a very united country, but it is on the surface it looks very diverse. In terms of governance, that means that India should have a good federal structure. If it is so diverse, then you cannot impose one model of governance on the whole country. So you have to have a federal structure, and the public policy makers right at the time of independence realized that. And when the Indian Constitution was handed down in 1950, it had the provision of states and governance entities even lower than states, and it had a clear line of authority running from the central government to these subunits, and it made them very concrete. It said that the certain areas were under the control of the central government, other areas were under the control of the state governments, and so on. So, for example, national defense and taxation, income taxation, foreign policy, etc. They are all under the control of the central government. Things like local police and agriculture and so on, they are under the purview of the state governments. Okay, so that meant that at the time, anyway, the central government could impose, for example, indirect taxes or customs duties, while the central government could not impose state taxes, for example, sales taxes. These were imposed by the state governments, and they were under the purview of the central government, and they were guarded by the constitution. So it did that, and then the couple of things happened. First was, I already talked about that a little bit, is that the pattern of development, agricultural development, differed sharply across the country. Okay, I talked about the fact that the Green Revolution was concentrated largely in wheat, which was grown mostly in northwestern India, and it did not spread so much to rice, which was grown in eastern India, and therefore the rice did not get that kind of benefit from the Green Revolution as the northwestern states did. So inequality opened up between the east and the west, and then the south of the country and the west of the country, particularly the south, became important manufacturing hubs, whereas the east did not. So as a consequence of that, there is substantial, by Indian standards, not by other country standards, substantial inequalities between eastern and western states. And more significantly, this inequality has persisted over time. Okay, so now so that requires that there should be two things. One is that there should be a major effort to improve economic growth in the eastern part of the country, which is now happening. It's very recently. Eastern states have been growing faster than western states, at least on the average. That has happened quite recently. And the second thing is that there should be a flow of funds from the center to the state governments, particularly the weaker state governments, the state governments that are not so rich, per capita incomes are low. This was enshrined in the formulation of the Finance Commission of India, and the Finance Commission of India is a statutory body, constitutional body, constituted by the President of India and reports to the Parliament of India. And there have been 14 finance commissions so far, and each one of them has very distinguished members, mostly economists and public policy makers. and they decide on what to do about distributing funds to various states. So the central government has a fair amount of money coming from its taxes, its income tax, customs duties, various other taxes, and it distributes some of that back to, quite a lot of it actually, to the state governments. So the formula that was used to distribute these monies has evolved over time, and it is basically trying to look after the interests of the less well-off states. That is how the formula is designed. But nevertheless, what happened is that after 1991, the role of the government, after the 1991 reforms, the role of the government in economic development was lessened. Okay, the country moved towards market-oriented reforms, and as a consequence of that, the extent to which the central government could reduce domestic inequalities was reduced. So the best hope for reducing inequality across India is to make sure that the eastern states grow at a very fast pace, which, as I said, is happening. I must add a caveat here that Indian inequality is far less than inequalities in other major developing countries. For example, in Brazil, in China particularly, it is very high. The gap between Shanghai and the western part of China is very high, in terms of much higher than India. But nevertheless, India is a democratic country, so these things are noticed by the press, and people talk about it, and there are agitations over it. So these things are very important. Now, prior to 2014, India also had another mechanism for transferring funds from the central government to the state governments, and that was called the Planning Commission. And so Planning Commission has brought out 12 5-year plans. Now the Planning Commission, the distribution through the Planning Commission was not subject to scrutiny by the Parliament. And the Planning Commission would not report to the Parliament. Planning Commission reported only to the Prime Minister of India. Okay, so there was a little bit of arbitrariness in this. Because the Prime Minister of the day could influence the way the funds would flow, and it would not be guided by a group of distinguished people working according to a common agenda. So this Planning Commission was dismantled, as I said, in 2014 after the Modi government took office. So this is the structure of federal finances, and I discuss the formula that have been used to distribute these funds from the central government to the state government, from state governments to panchayats and to local bodies like municipalities and so on. Then I talk a little bit about the reform of indirect taxes. Indirect taxes in India were very complicated by that provision of the constitution that states could levy their own taxes and on items that were under their purview, for example sales taxes and so on, octroi, but the central government could not force them to have a common tax policy. So as a consequence, India was a very fractured market, okay, and this revealed itself in a number of ways. For example, because of this complex of taxes, which differed from state to state, to send goods from one state to another state, it had a different set of taxes, and there will be taxes on taxes as the goods move to different parts of the country. So it was a very anti-investment kind of atmosphere. So as a consequence of that, there was a lack of market integration in various markets, particularly in food markets. Okay, so grain markets would be insulated from each other. So there was a local shortage. For example, in Odisha, there have been local shortage. The fact that goods could not flow in from other parts of the country which had a surplus of wheat or rice or whatever the deficiency was, meant that Odisha had to suffer in isolation. So these things have been dismantled over time, and market integration is now much more the rule rather than the exception in India. And then the big change that has occurred is that the institution of the Goods and Services Tax, which came about on the 1st of July 2017. For the first time, India has an integrated indirect tax structure. So now India has, as the popular slogan goes, India is one country, one tax in terms of indirect taxes. So all the impediments to movement of goods between across states have been removed, and that is a very, very good thing. So India started on this journey towards this indirect tax structure in 2005 when the value-added tax was introduced, but states could levy value-added taxes at their own rates. That was also a problem, but now we have an indirect tax structure which actually integrates all the state taxes into one tax and dovetails them with the central commodity taxes. So this is a major improvement in indirect taxes. This will now mean that producers can set up shop in any part of the country. So if they set up shop in a state with a low wage, they can sell the products in a state with a higher wage. So that industrialization would move to states with low wages, particularly in the east part of the country, and that will mean that regional inequality will also get lower over time.
Mm-hmm. All right, Dr. Jha, so that's all about chapter 5.